graphic figures there of what's happened to political parties, none more than to PASOK, to your own. And I mentioned at the start that in terms of turnout at elections, you know, it's everywhere across Europe it's falling. Nonetheless, in Greece it was 65%. So an awful lot of people still got out and voted, and the bottom line is they gave you a bloody nose because you were in charge of an utter debacle. That's democracy, isn't it?
Of course, this is democracy, and people can decide, but we have to take into account under which kind of conditions people decide. It is totally different to be in social peace, and people have to choose their alternative. It is totally different if the majority of people are under a personal catastrophe. If you are under personal catastrophe, I don't know how you react. I mean, now there is desperate people, and where people are desperate, you don't know if there is a passive reaction or an explosion. And in these cases of an explosion, there is another discussion about democracy and how it will work.
Okay, and thank you very much indeed. As I say, I'm going to open this up to questions. Just to say, if you'd like to stand, it's probably a bit easier for us to see where you are, and the microphone will come to you. If you could tell us who you are, where you're from, and if you can, please keep it to a relatively concise question. Thank you very much indeed. Sir, your hand was straight up.
Brian Crowe, former British diplomat and Eurocrat. Of course I understand what Anna Diamantopoulou is saying and the pressures in Greece. They're obvious to everybody. Nonetheless, there is a clash. What happens when what the people want clashes with what they can have? Greece was hugely in debt. Something had to happen. The European Union is blamed, but there are other countries outside the European Union who have also crashed when what the public wanted and what the political system was offering them were totally contradictory. Take the case of Argentina. How do you sort out that dilemma?
You're right that something must be done, and of course the Greek political system has the main responsibility of what happened for years. It was a mismanagement, a fiscal mismanagement. There were big problems, and people knew very well. And in the beginning and the onset of the crisis, people were supporting the whole effort. There was a self-understanding. People understood very well, and the political system understood very well, that we had to penalize ourselves what has happened. So we started the program. And in the beginning, it went quite well. And then it was understandable that there were no results. There was no way out. And the difference with Argentina or other countries is that Greece was the first case in the economic history that a country has to deal with a debt crisis without having its own currency. So it was a very complicated issue. We couldn't have a policy like Argentina or otherwise. We had to work with the European Union. And what I'm saying is that the whole project has not taken into account the real conditions. There was a need of more time, and there was a need to cooperate on different dimensions. If you have no development, if you have only recession, and we have a contract, the Greek economy has contracted out of 20% until now, and 24% up to the 2014, it is as it was in the Great Depression. It was 27%. What was the remedy there? It was growth, development, jobs. Now we do exactly the opposite. And there is no way out for the time being. Is the debt sustainable? Yes, we try a lot. There is a fiscal adjustment. But can it go without growth? Can we proceed with no growth policies? And this is what I'm saying now, that at the European level, we need to change this and to give some space to breathe.
Okay, we've got quite a few questions coming. I did say to the gentleman there, and then we'll go back over to there, please. Yes, thank you.
David Graham, Chatham House member. You start saying it's international and European problems, and that's code in my language is for politicians to say, it's not my fault, it was someone else over there that did it, and we've got the problem. There isn't one EU, there's many EUs, many countries inside the EU all have very different agendas. How do you work out this democratic problem that started way before the financial crash of 2008 to really make the EU gel together?
First of all, to make it very clear, I didn't say that it is you or the others who are responsible. I said it, I was very clear and I repeat it. It is, first of all, it is our own problem. But it is not only that. And I don't believe that this is the real analysis. It is the global crisis, it is the European problems, and it was the national problems as well. Now, you are right. There are many and different countries at the European level. And what I believe is that the European Union is a unique entity. And even now, in this crisis, at least in Greece, 68% of the population believe to the European Union. And they want euro, and they want the European Union. So what we have to do is to analyze and to understand the deficiencies of the past and to move forward. My answer to the European problem is more Europe, not less Europe. And when we are talking about more Europe, I believe that we need fiscal union, budget union, and of course we can discuss what it means. And of course, a more political union, because there is a problem of democracy in the way that the institutions work today. We must something more political, and we need a more important role of the national parliaments at the European level.
Thank you very much. And now, sorry, if we go back to where you were, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Sylvia Urken from the London School of Economics. You touched upon the figure a few times in your presentation, the extremely high youth unemployment numbers in Southern Europe especially. More worrying than the effect on the short term, I was more wondering, what do you think will be the effects of this generation that's disillusioned with politics, with the national economy, on the long term, and what would this mean for European and national democracy?
One of the biggest problems now for the economy and for the future of the country, the economic, the social and political future of the country, is the brain drain and the problem of young people. We have a huge problem of brain drain. People and the more skillful and qualified people leave Greece now and leave the south, not only Greece. And on the other side, the young people do not trust at all the politicians and the political system, and they do not participate. They are very active in the internet, and they are very active in any kind of organizations, but not in politics. So I really cannot give you an answer because in all my presentation, this is my big agony, how we have a generation that cannot find its role in the economic field and in the political field. And this is what we have to put as a priority.
Thank you. Sorry, it's one down here, please.
Pedro Solares, I'm a Chatham House member. You said that no country had you had no control over your currency. You didn't have your own currency. Argentina was pegged 1-to-1 to the dollar for about 10 years, 12 years, I think. When it hit the crisis that you hit much later, it got out of the dollar, the peg, and devalued. Now there was no good option, but that was one option which Greece could have taken. It could have left the euro temporarily, and then many years later, maybe come back, once you had reformed yourself, once you had growth, and by devaluation, you could have brought in many tourists, etc. So that was an option that the major parties decided not to take, and perhaps it was a mistake.
Maybe it was an option. I don't agree at all, and there is a big difference between what was in Argentina and in Greece. Because Greece is not just, it does not have just the same currency with other countries or the European Union, but it is a member of an institution of the European Union and the European and the Eurozone, which is not similar with anything in the world, because for years, for more than 30 years, the whole economy, the structures, our legislation has been adjusted with the European one. 78% of our legislation is the European one. All our structures are connected with the European ones. So it is not, I believe that we cannot even imagine that Greece could leave the euro because it could be an economic and social catastrophe. And as you can imagine, there was a lot of discussion in Greece as well, that we have seen all the options. And if we could imagine that it could be better for our people, we could decide it. But there are no evidence at all that things could be better. So it is not an option for us.
Thank you. Okay, if we could just come to this gentleman here, and it helps to have a bright red jumper, doesn't it? That works. And then a question from over there, and then we might have to move on. Thank you.
My name is Thimios Jalas. I'm a Greek journalist. And I would like to ask you about the intervention of economic institutions like Central Bank, European Central Bank, the IMF, in Greek situation. They saved the Greek economy, at least for the moment. On the other hand, they have weakened public confidence in the ability of politicians to tackle the crisis with their own political action. So my question is, would you participate in a coalition government under a technocrat in the future, like the Socialist Party has already done in the past? Or are you afraid that this may cause more alienation, public alienation from politics?
Since you are a Greek journalist, you know that I have already participated in a government under a technocrat, but it was a very urgent situation. I don't believe that it is very, very dangerous to believe that we enter in an era that technocrats will save the countries. No, I believe that democracy must work and politicians must do their job. But at the same time, and just to speak for Greece, I believe that the Greek Prime Minister, every Greek Prime Minister must choose the best of the best Greeks around the world, being them politicians or technocrats, to save the country.
Well, that does point towards a technocrat government, really, doesn't it?
It had to do it. I don't believe that it did it, but this maybe was the way out. But I believe that the Prime Minister has to be must have a political support, must have been elected.
Okay, thank you. And yes.
Thank you. Nigel Hall, a member. You've given us a stark picture of the political and social crisis that we're heading for. Looking not just at Greece, but across the European Union, you were a commissioner for 5 years. What are your top 3 biggest regrets with the benefit of hindsight? And what do you wish that you had done most that would have helped prepare, helped warn, helped avert the scale of political and social crisis that's coming? And if I may have a supplementary, 3 years from now, do you think that the scenario will be one of muddle on, evolution, and just about recovery? Or do you think there's high drama coming? Thank you.
So only 3 regrets to work on. That's a start.
Unfortunately, I cannot be neither pessimistic nor optimistic. And in my village, there is a saying, "Make me a prophet to make you a king." I believe that there is no way out for our continent than in that strengthening the European institutions and the role of the European Union. And now we know very well what the deficiencies were. The most important was that the architecture of the euro was a problematic one, because we have a currency and we didn't have a common economic policy. So we do need a common economic policy. And at the same time, we have very weak control mechanisms. And what happened the last 10 years, more or less, the European institutions had to be able to understand suddenly in 2008, we spoke about the crisis. Now we know that the figures were very clear and we could have understood what the problems were. So more union, economic union, common political goals at the European level, because I believe that the shift in the geopolitical era, the shift to the east, from the west to the east, makes it a necessity for the European countries to be together. European states are very small. The biggest of them, it is less than 1% of the population, of the worldwide population. So we need to be together, we need to work together, and if we want to have, not to have a drama, as you said, we had to be united in a different and more well-organized way. I don't believe at all that small European countries can work in the future today, can be successful in the future today.
Anna, thank you very much indeed for now. I know you're not going to go away, but you're going to just sit there. There may be another opportunity to bring you in, but many thanks indeed for your contributions, Anna. And we're going to have a soft shoe shuffle here, as I'm going to call on our panel of three now to join us. Peter Kellner, Lord Liddle, and Paul-Alexandre Martin. And gents, if you'd like to come and take a pew. Peter is the president and former chairman of YouGov, the market research and polling company where he's been working since founding back in 2000, and a journalist and author of note as well, of course. Welcome to Paul-Alexandre Martin, who's come over from Paris for us. Paul-Alexandre is a member of the Front National in France, and thank you for making the trip over to be with us. And Lord Liddle is the chair of the international think tank Policy Network and was Labour spokesman on Europe, is in the House of Lords, I should say, was European advisor, of course, to Tony Blair from 1997 to 2004, and then from 2004 to 2007, an advisor in the European Commission to Peter Mandelson and indeed President Barroso. So, gentlemen, welcome and thank you all for joining us here now. What I'm going to do to start with, and again, we will open this up to you, of course, for questions and answers, is first of all perhaps to give us a 5-minute snapshot from each of your perspectives on the question of the state of democracy, the level of crisis that is found within Europe. And Peter, you're closest to me, so you can start.
Oh, David, thank you very much indeed. Let me, in order to try and perhaps get a bit of controversy going, suggest that the idea of a crisis of democracy, I think the debate risks descending into two errors. One is an error of history and the other is an error of logic and terminology. Historically, Europe has never been as democratic, as peaceful, or as prosperous as it now is. As you can tell from my name, Kellner, I have Central European roots. My father was Jewish, brought up in Vienna between the two world wars. And if you look at the trajectory of the Europe of the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, there was a slump far worse than anything you've seen in recent times. We had Nazism, we had the Second World War, we had the tyranny of communist rule in Eastern Europe. And if my father or my grandfather were to come back to life now, with the perspective of what they went through in the middle decades of the 20th century, they would recognize there are problems, but I'm not sure that they would say this is a crisis of the same magnitude as the one they faced some decades ago. So that's the historic warning of historical error. And I'm just one tiny, as it were, postscript to that. Yes, we have had in recent times, especially in the former Yugoslavia, some really horrific things happening. But even there, we now have, as of 2 or 3 months ago, we have the leaders of Serbia and Kosovo actually meeting face to face. So one of the last bits of brutal conflict is perhaps, just perhaps, on the way to some sort of resolution. And the potential error of logic and terminology. There are times when I would love to evade gravity, to float up from the platform of a tube station up to the booking office nice and easily. I'd like a society which, in the words of that song from the musical Camelot, the rain never fell till after sundown. I would love to eat limitless numbers of the great croissants and muffins you provided as we came in and not put on weight. Is this a crisis of democracy that no party is offering to repeal the laws of gravity or of meteorology or of biology? Well, it's plainly absurd. So why is it when our parties are unable to repeal the laws of arithmetic, we say it's a crisis of democracy? And I think what we heard from Anna is an eloquent account of a society that faces a crisis of economics and arithmetic, and perhaps even of internal honesty, because the government, as I understand it, the government that you took over from when PASOK came to power, 3 years ago, had basically lied to itself, to the public, to Europe, about the state of the finances. And that part of what you've been going through is a consequence of that dishonesty. Now, that is plainly a very specific sort of Greek issue, on top of the other international issues. But I think, actually, although there are dangers, democracy has come through, not just in Greece, but in Europe, North America, come through rather well, and is coming through rather well. Are there problems? Yes. But I think the fact that the Front National in France has never got beyond, I think, 18% in a presidential or parliamentary election, well, for decades, the default figure for far-right nationalism has been in the mid-teens. Occasionally, as in Austria, I think about 17, 18 years ago, it got up to 25, 26%, but then went down again. And equally, the far left was far stronger in the days immediately after the Second World War in Western Europe, getting 20, sometimes 30%, and has come back down. That's how life is. There will always be a minority who are looking for populist right-wing solutions. There will always be a minority looking for, as it were, simple get rid of capitalism solutions. But compared with, as it were, the world that my father grew up in and my grandfather was an adult in, I actually think we're not doing that badly. So let's perhaps just bring a bit of perspective to this.
Peter, thank you very much indeed for that. Can I just before moving on to Paul-Alexandre, Anna put up the Weimar Republic rubric earlier. You dismissed that with a wave of the hand, would you? Peter? Sorry.
No, I wouldn't dismiss a wave of the hand. One can get into a very specific argument about what happened in the Weimar Republic. Plainly in the international setting, and one of the great differences is that actually we've learnt from internationally the great slump of the 20s and 30s. I think our economic governance across the world isn't great, but it's not nearly as catastrophic as it was in the late 20s and early 30s. Keynes has happened, and the world has moved on. And secondly, as I say, one could get into a very long debate about Weimar, but just remember that there were people, including Dean Keynes, who said at the time of the Treaty of Versailles, you were creating the next World War. I think the circumstances are different. Should we be careful? Yes. Should we be worried? Yes. But I don't think it's the same.
Okay, Peter, thank you very much. Paul-Alexandre, welcome again. Front National benefiting, it would seem, in terms of popular support. What's your take on the crisis or otherwise that democracy is facing in the EU, and where do you apportion the blame?
First of all, thank you for your invitation again, and I would like to apologize for my French accent to the audience. there's a big crisis today, and I don't really agree with what you were saying before, because if you compare to 1929 and the 20th century, maybe it seems not that serious to you sometimes, and you can think that it's not that important. But when we were looking at the Greek statistics you showed us before, we can see that the situation is very important I think about the rate unemployment, especially. And in France today, we have about 6 million unemployers, 9 million poor, and we have a big crisis, for example, for people who are looking for a place to live. No. So I think it's a big crisis and a big economical crisis. We have today big economical forces as financial markets, as the rating agencies that are more powerful than governments and politicians. So people can't understand why they are elected, why do they have to elect some politicians if they have to apply what the economic forces tell them to do. We have a big crisis about the debt. If you look at the statistics in Greece, in Spain, in Italy, even in France, we have a debt that is increasing day after day. We have a real democracy crisis, a real. If you look at the last European election in France, 60% of the people chose to not vote, which means they don't believe in the institutions and they don't think that politicians can resolve their problems. When in 2005 the European Constitution was rejected by the French people, what happened then? Nicolas Sarkozy, who was elected in 2007 with José Manuel Barroso at that time, decided to vote a new treaty, which is the same as the European Constitution, called the Lisbon Treaty. Then the Irish people in 2008 rejected it again. And the European Commission came and said, your vote was not good. You have to vote again. So this is a real crisis of democracy, and this is a non-democratic behavior from the European institution. And I think that crisis is, of course, an economical and social crisis. We have a democracy crisis, and we have, in a lot of European countries, such as mine, a big identity crisis, but that's not the subject today. I'm talking about, of course, immigration, and of course, about a nation that is the real place where we have to run. You have to how can I say that? Politicians have to have the power, not to the European institution and to the international institutions, which are non-elected institutions.
Paul-Alexandre, thank you very much indeed. Lord Liddle, Roger, would you like to pick up the baton there?
Yes, thanks. It's very, very good of you to come from Paris, but one of the things that struck me listening to you speaking then is that quite a lot of people in this room will have watched Nigel Farage, leader of UKIP, on the television last night on Question Time. And I think that where I sort of disagree fundamentally with your position, really, is the view that the nation state in the modern world can determine its own economic and political future. I just don't think that the kind of world we now live in, and I think that this is what the vision that Nigel Farage has, that, you know, if only Britain can get back control of all the powers that it's lost to Europe, it will be able to determine its own destiny. I just don't think that in the world of globalization that we're now in, that is at all a realistic one. And I think that we have to be, I mean, the reason why I've always been a very strong European in British politics is because I think that's the way of democracy getting control of these global forces. I don't see any other way that we can for the future. Now, that's just a general point to start with. I don't think that the European Union's handling of the Greek crisis has been very good. I think a lot of mistakes have been made. I think that were too slow off the mark, then panicked. There was a need actually to write off a substantial portion of Greece's debt, and that wasn't done. Then the austerity program is far too severe over too short a period. I think that there are a lot of mistakes made, but nonetheless, I still think that the Greek people were right in their election, as it were, to opt to stay in, and their position outside, if they adopted their own currency once again, I think would be catastrophic. So and far worse than the one they face now. Now, just on what does this mean for democracy and legitimacy? I think that the problem, the worry that I have about the developments in Europe at the moment, and these are very much my personal views, I have to say, is that Europe is kind of feeling its way towards a solution of the euro crisis, and I think if you had people here from the European Commission, they would say that it was well on the way to being mended. But it's been done very intergovernmentally. And the political worry, of course, is that because it's being done intergovernmentally, it looks as though the most powerful member state, Germany, is calling all the shots. And that this isn't the kind of democratic vision of Europe that most of us wanted to see. And it plays back to all kinds of old fears. And the question is this sustainable? And I think, in fact, it isn't. And I think that in the long run, but I don't actually think this is going to happen in the next 2 or 3 years, but I think that in the next decade, there will have to be a facing up to the crisis of democratic legitimacy in Europe. And I think that that's got 2 elements to it. I do agree with Anna that national parliaments have to play a bigger role in the decision-making of the EU, that is an important dimension that's been lost. And I think that particularly if, for the euro area, then fiscal policy decisions are going to be taken collectively, then the national parliaments have to play a role in that. But also, I think that you have to have a central elected authority which is bigger than any member state, even Germany. And that's why I think in the long run we've got to go for some kind of elected president of Europe.
Roger, can I just pick up on that? If you want more democratization at the highest levels in the European Union, aren't you also almost automatically saying it will probably take longer to take decisions? And one of the first things you said here was we were very slow off the mark, or they were very slow off the mark in getting to grips with the economic crisis.
Well, that's a fair point, but of course, if you're trying to secure consensus between member states, that takes a long time as well. I think that yes, it is difficult to achieve reform in Europe. It is difficult to achieve consensus, but we're better to have it that way than not to have it at all.
Okay, thank you. And Peter, a point I wanted to put to you, the crisis, what crisis, in terms of democracy? How do you feel about, for example, the National Front, the Front National, growing in popularity in France? And as we saw on Anna's graph there, the party she referred to as the neo-Nazis growing in Greece. Is that not a sign for many people of a crisis of sorts? Yes, you can throw back to pre-war. That actually is a different world. It was a different time. We're looking at a different sort of crisis. I mean, dare I say in the BBC, we use the word crisis far too much, but that nonetheless, this is a crisis of sorts, surely. This is not a great day for democracy, is it?
I'm not sure it is, David. I remember before I was a pollster, I was a journalist, and as you say, one likes to use dramatic language because that's how your stories get noticed. But my worry is that if one uses the word crisis too much, it becomes so devalued that when you get something which is a far bigger, as it were, existential challenge to countries, to lives, to democratic institutions, what word goes beyond crisis? Now, take your points about the performance of the far right. Well, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on individual countries, but just let me say, in Greece, it grew because it wasn't there before. But it's getting towards a stage which, as I was saying earlier, the sort of default level of right-wing nationalism across Europe for the last 20, 30 years has been in the mid-teens percentage-wise. So Greece, it's gone from practically nothing to around that level. Now, in France, now, I clearly stand to be corrected, but what you saw very briefly was the Front National. The moment they really sort of became credible was when Mitterrand cynically changed the constitution or the electoral system for the National Assembly in the mid-80s to make it proportional, because a proportional system gave the Front National, I think, 20 or 30 seats then when it had had none before. And the interesting thing is that it actually hasn't made that many gains in votes since. In 2002, Jean-Marie Le Pen became second in the first round with, I think, 17, 18%, was it? And got no more in the second round. Chirac just wiped him out. I think it was 82-18. And it was about the same level in the recent presidential elections last year. And you've got one or two members of the National Assembly. Now it's gone back to a majoritarian system. So I'm not sure the premise, David, your question is right, that we're seeing this inexorable rise. What we see is nationalist parties in a number of countries, Austria, Italy, it's happened. When certain things happened, they spring up, gets to around the mid-teens. In Austria, they went higher and then came back down. But there does seem to me a figure beyond which no really nationalist party has gone beyond and stayed beyond. And I think given the upheavals, we talked about immigration and multiculturalism briefly, I think given the changes that have happened and indeed the economic challenges, I think it's striking that right-wing populism hasn't made far more gains than it is. Could we face a crisis where a far-right party gains enough votes to be a major part of government? Possibly. When it does, we'll have to deal with that. But I think it is actually, I'm a glass half full rather than glass half empty. I think the interesting thing has happened in Scandinavia. When these things have happened, actually, the conventional system so far has managed to keep it at arm's length. Now, perhaps we can come on to a separate issue about national versus European governance and democracy, because I've got things I'd like to say about that at some point. But I'm not that pessimistic about the influence of the far right.
Roger, please.
I just wanted to say that also it's not just right populism that's been defeated, it's also left-wing populism. I thought that the one political event that most encouraged me in 2012 was the result of the Dutch election. Because at the start of the Dutch election campaign, it looked as though the biggest parties would be the far-left Socialist Party, which was taking a position which was anti-European but welfarist. We can have higher pensions and full employment, but we can not have anything to do with Europe. And also you had the Wilders Party on the right. And they looked as though they were going to be the dominant factors in Dutch politics. There was a 2 or 3 month election campaign, and the mainstream Labour Party and the Liberals together formed a coalition after it. And there was a very big shift in public opinion against the populist parties on both the left and the right. I thought that was very... because they had a real debate about their country's future in Europe and what the options were, and they came round, they rejected populism.
Paul-Alexandre, I just wonder if you feel that the Front National sees this as the opportunity to find yourself on what we call a crest of a wave and to maintain a rise in public popularity, or once again, and it's interesting that the point Roger made there, once again, the centre-right will steal some of your clothes, perhaps, some of your policy clothes, and you will remain at a base which is certainly not enough to dominate the landscape in France.
First of all, what I would like to say is about when you say populist or when you say extremist, the people, especially the politicians who use those words, it's like to put a label on people, you know, so they can keep you away from the institutions or from the debate. You know, you're like someone who is you are doing political things, but you are special and you are dangerous. So that's what they want to say. And first of all, I don't feel like I'm a dangerous person. I have my ideas. I want to defend them. I'm not anti-European like you were saying a few minutes later. I am against, the European Union as it's done today. I am deeply European. I feel, I do believe there's a European civilization. It's a continent. I'm not against Europe. That would be stupid. But I am against this union today as it's made. About the threat to the democracy, that's really funny to me because, like I said before, today there's no government or state ruled by a populist. But in 2005 and in 2008, when people rejected treaties, they were made to vote again. They were forced to vote again by people who won the government in several countries in Europe, like in France, in Holland, in Ireland, like I told later. And this is an undemocratic behavior. So we are not responsible for this. I mean, if I could have voted in 2005, I would have rejected this treaty, and I would have been forced to apply it after 2008 because the parliament voted for it, and they refused to the people a referendum on this question. About the classical right wing and what you call the center right, I don't think we could have an agree today because we are really opposed on several questions, and especially on the fact that the right wing don't want to change the system, the political system in France. You said you're right before that we used to have I think it was 36 parliament. How would you say? Parliamentaries. Thank you. Yeah. Parliamentaries in 1986, and now we have 2 parliamentaries at the parliament, whereas 6 million people voted for us at the presidential election, and that's again an undemocratic behavior. So I don't think that populist parties are a threat to Europe or to people. I mean, in France today, the Front National is the only party who defend the idea of sovereignty, the idea of protectionism, to protect our borders with taxes, for example. We are the only organization that propose that to people. And if tomorrow our organization would have been forbidden in name of democracy, how can people express themselves?
Peter, I have something still, it's niggling away, your position on democracy and no crisis. We do see, it's true, ever-increasing numbers of people coming out on the streets, protesting. Some of it is violent. There is no hint that that is going to decline across particularly southern Europe, but indeed across parts of Western and Northern Europe as well. They're doing that because they do feel disenfranchised. They don't feel that the main political parties offer them much, if indeed any politicians at all do. That has to be let's say, a critical position for European politicians to observe, and at the moment they seem to have little idea as to how to resolve.
David, look, that's obviously right. We have some very profound economic and social problems. But then, you know, when there's been a time in the history of Europe when there has never been somewhere some profound economic and social problems. That's what I say. Let's get a bit of perspective.
Sure, but let me just sorry to interrupt you there, but I was talking to Anna just beforehand, and we mentioned the point that our paths crossed in Brussels, as Anna finished as European Commissioner, I arrived. This was in the 90s. And suddenly those looked like halcyon days. Those were relatively prosperous, stable, manageable times. We're not there anymore.
All right, but okay, let's take Greece, and perhaps you can invite Anna to comment on what I'm about to say. Let us, schematically, let us say, naught is when you're under the thumb of brutal Nazi occupation in between 41 and 44. Let's say 10 is contentment, democracy, prosperity, and reasonably full employment. So perhaps the era of the colonels would be, 2 or 3 in that scale from 0 to 10, towards the bottom end, but plainly not as bad as it was in the early 40s. Where are we now? Now, I would say on that schema, we're perhaps at 5 or 6. We're plainly well short of prosperity and contentment, but we're not at 0 or 1 or 2 or 3. So, and now maybe other people will say to me, actually, we're in 8 or 9. We're very, very much close. Sorry, we're at 2 or 3. We're very much closer to the colonels or to Nazi occupation. I don't think so. But so let's try and get some degree of historical perspective in this. It's bad. I would hate to be a Greek youngster leaving school or college. I would hate it. But even so, is it like it was in Athens in 1942 or in 1969? No, I don't think so.
Anna, at that point, does Peter read the scale correctly? I mean, is there a danger that from up here in the north, we perhaps don't fully perceive what it's like?
If I understand well, there is an optimistic approach, and Peter says, okay, we have such an experience in Europe. The past was so bad that now we can be optimistic because circumstances are different. Young people are really desperate, but on the same side, they're overqualified. They can do things. So, okay, I accept it. What I'm saying, and why I referred to Weimar, I don't believe that it's the same situation. No, there is not. But why I did it, because at that time, there are speeches and articles in Great Britain and in France that they couldn't imagine that something could happen in Germany. Nobody believed that this nasty, small, populistic party would do anything. And I don't believe that it can do in Greece. But it is something that we have to worry. We have to understand that things have changed. And since a few years ago, prosperity and peace was the core project of Europe, it is not anymore. So we have again to give this hope of prosperity and peace in Europe. It is in danger. This is what I believe. And if this core project is in danger, then there is no stabilization. There is no democracy. It is after the stabilization. So I believe that things are a bit worse than you believe.
But so it seems to me, and it's an important but specific difference. I'm broadly encouraged that the processes are there. They're boring and they're tedious. And you read about it in the Financial Times and not in the Sun. But this is historically, this is a much healthier way of doing things than we used to do things in Europe for centuries. So my belief is that in 5 or 10 years' time, Greece will plainly be on the process of recovery because the rest of Europe wants that to happen. And even if it's not always very smart or very quick, broadly, it will happen. Whereas in the 20s and 30s, the way we did things in Europe led to catastrophe. I do actually think we have learned. Not enough, not fast enough, or deep enough, but we're not in the same position in terms of the way Europe does things. And, perhaps you should be encouraged that Brussels is so tedious, does produce so much paper, there are so many interpreters. It is a mind-bogglingly, boring thing. But my goodness, boring rather than fighting is surely far superior.
I don't think people would argue with that. Roger, can I want to lift your FT Sun analogy for a moment there, Peter, because actually one thing the Sun will tell you is that, yes, Germany's telling us what to do again, telling Europe what to do again. And you mentioned, Roger, the sort of big Berlin issue. How worrying is that? Is there anything that can be done about that even?
Well, I think that the most encouraging thing about it is that the Germans are really worried about it themselves, and that they don't want to be in this position in Europe for the longer term. And that's why I think that eventually, I think that at the moment, their view is we've got to resolve the crisis, focus on the banking union and the fiscal union and labour market reform, and sort of get those things sorted. But I think in the long run, by that I mean, over the next 10 years, I think we will get a big debate about democratic accountability, and I think that the Christian Democrats, Social Democrats in Germany do favour much stronger political integration, and I think all that will come back.
Roger, thank you very much indeed.
Posing problems, very big problems for the UK if we're still a member of the European Union by then. But I think what can I just say something about the UK debate? What I find so depressing about the UK debate is that everybody discusses it in terms of the benefits of Europe as being members of this economic club, the single market, that in terms of jobs and all that. Well, of course that's true, and it's very important for the UK. But how often do you get British politicians talking about the benefits of the unity of Europe, which we've achieved in the last 50 years, and that this is fundamentally a peace and prosperity project in which Britain ought to be playing a leading role, and that I think is something that greatly saddens me.
It was extraordinary how much criticism, scalding criticism there was for the Nobel Peace Prize, for example, wasn't it?
Yes, indeed.
Roger, thank you. Now, certainly.
When we're talking about the European Union and translations and procedures and blah, 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 and it is really boring. And as a previous commissioner, I know very well that fiscal union and budget union and all these things I said about means nothing to people, absolutely nothing. So what we need now is a narrative, a European narrative. We must give an answer to people. Why do we need more Europe? Can we give this answer to a British? Can we persuade him? Can we persuade a Greek or a French? We need this narrative, and this narrative is a different one than it was in the past. Because of the geopolitical situation, because of the problem in peace, because of the problem in prosperity, we need the narrative. And this is what the leadership at the European level has to do. And this is the problem of Europe. We have not the leadership needed for the time being.
They're champing at the bit, but I'll indulge you because you want to just respond on that very quickly.
20 seconds to say this. To me, the problem, I don't like the crisis, the problem at the core of this is that politics is national, finance is international. And so we're all groping for, we all, in these decades, this is not just about the current recession or whatever, we're groping for a mechanism or a series of mechanisms and procedures that can reconcile national politics and international financial pressures. And this is work in progress. It will take way beyond my lifetime, maybe way beyond this century. But the point about Europe, and this is why I'm fundamentally an optimist, is for all the idiocy and nonsense and tedium and inefficiency, this is actually a project which is trying to negotiate its way through that fundamental issue. As I say, somebody coming from the 12th, 14th, 18th, 19th century, looking at Europe today, they think, my goodness, this is brilliant. You've got these continental-wide challenges, and you're trying to peacefully negotiate and debate your way through them. That's why I'm an optimist.
It's Good 20 seconds. Thank you, Peter. Right. Now, yes, well, I think I should, just to give you the opportunity, certainly. Sorry,
no,
we'll be on to
about the arguments I am hearing now that say that Europe is in crisis, so we need more Europe, more political Europe. And I think it's a misunderstanding, because when you're looking at the last creation of the European Union, for example, the Eurozone, in the last 10 years, the Eurozone was the zone, the monetary zone in the world where the growth was the lowest. And when I'm talking with people and I say, okay, European Union is a great creation, why? And people are talking about me about concrete projects such as Ariane, Airbus, which are big projects, big industrial projects, and they were successful, but they were created when we were cooperated between states, not with a supranational power at the Commission, which members who are not elected by people. And I think that's a big problem, because today, every time we are talking about the crisis, the European governments are how can I say that? Are abusing of the situation to say and to explain to people that they need more power, and they have this power. They have this power today. 80% of the laws in France come from the European Commission. So who has the power?
No, the European
Thank you very much.
European
Right,
Parliament.
now let's open this up to the floor. I'll start with a few different hands if I can. We'll start right at the very back there, and we'll work our way forwards. Thank you.
Hello, good morning. John Algar from Bright Blue. Peter, I found the sense of optimism you injected into the debate this morning really refreshing. And Lord Liddle touched on it as well, that actually from a grand historical perspective, Europe is actually, in terms of stability and democracy, not doing so bad. So I guess my question is, as someone who really understands the mechanics of the UK media, why do you think this narrative is so often lacking? Why is there no sense of this, grand scheme in the popular press?
Do you want to answer straight away?
Yes, do. Yeah, we'll start.
Good question. The easy thing to say is because you've got very particular people in charge of particular media who have their own agenda. I think that's a bit of the answer, but only a bit of the answer. I have to say that I think that the bigger answer is that British media reflect we won the war. Well, we didn't win the war, but we were on the winning side. We were junior partners on the winning side. And therefore, we've never, as a country, had the same concept of Britain's place in Europe that applies to most of the rest of the continent. So it isn't actually just the Telegraph and the Sun and the Mail. Even, as it were, the pro-European papers like the Mirror or the Guardian or the Independent, they still report the world as if it's Britain and the world and Europe's out there somewhere. Whereas, if you look at the bulk of the French or German or Italian or Polish media, they regard their relationship with the rest of the world as being through Europe. So I'm not going to just take the easy thing. It's all to do with sort of Rupert Murdoch and people like that, or Paul Dacre. I think there is something far more fundamental about the way Britain views its own identity. And the miracle is, with that, as it were, exceptionalism, we've managed to be, so much part of Europe for so long. But then I think the problem is a more fundamental one than just the Europhobes in particular papers.
Okay, thank you. As I say, we'll work our way down a little bit. So the gentleman on the edge of the middle aisle there, yes.
John Tessiulis, Faculty of Laws, University College London. I was taken aback a bit by the 2 points that Peter Kellner made, the historical and the logical point. I mean, the historical point that it was worse in the past, isn't that a bit like saying, my heart attack is not a health crisis because my father's cancer was much worse? Aren't we entitled to talk about a crisis in a case where there's a massive violation of human rights or basic rights of citizens? Now, Mrs. Diamantopoulou says to us that 62% of young women in Greece are unemployed. The consequence of that being their lives being potentially destroyed or being forced to seek their livelihoods by abandoning their families and their culture. that is a basic minimum we would expect as human beings, as citizens of Europe, to be satisfied. If it's being systematically violated in that way, then I think the words crisis have a meaningful resonance. Now, on the logical point, what condemns these 62% of women to unemployment? Is it, as Mr. Kellner suggests, a combination of inexorable laws of arithmetic and the dishonesty of Greek politicians? Or has it also got something to do with the economic assumptions behind an austerity package, economic assumptions that are in fact not the equivalent of laws of arithmetic, but actually contestable and ought to be contestable in some kind of democratically accountable process?
Well, thank you very much for that. That's a strong and powerful statement. I think I know what your response would be, Peter. We've heard that. Many thanks for that. Okay. Yes, gentleman there, right there. Thank you.
Michael Roberts, member of Chatham House. Roger Liddle asks us to contemplate the possibility in the long term of a directly elected President of Europe. There is a school of thought that says that the next President of the European Commission should be elected in 2014. One scenario for that election, not a direct election, but one in keeping perhaps with an interpretation of the Lisbon Treaty, is that each political grouping in the European Parliament should nominate a candidate for Commission President, and that the winner of the European elections in 2014, the group that wins those elections, should have its nominee as the only candidate who would be endorsed by the European Parliament for President of the European Commission. Does the panel think that that scenario would address the democratic deficit? If not, what method of choosing the next President of the European Commission might do so?
Michael, thank you. Roger.
I think there's quite a high chance that's what's going to happen. That the EPP and the Socialists will nominate their candidates, and the argument will then be that whichever grouping can command the largest share of votes in the European Parliament will have the presidency. And I think that actually it would be quite difficult for the European Council to refuse to go along with that. I think I know that under the terms of the... I'm right, Michael, aren't I, that under the terms of the Lisbon Treaty, the European Council nominates and the Parliament has to approve. You know. But I think it would be quite difficult for the Parliament not to nominate the choice of this process. But we shall see. So I think that's going to be an interesting thing in 2014.
Any comment, Peter?
Yeah, I think Roger's right on the narrow point that if there is if the EPP is the biggest party and there is an obvious dominant candidate, then probably it will pan out as Roger suggests. But however, it will still be the Council, the intergovernmental body, that makes the recommendation. And I think there's an important line that will not be crossed between the decision being made by the Council with the vetoes that are in there and moving to an explicit process of popular election, whether direct or indirect. That would need a change in the treaty. You're not going to get that. And also, personally, although I'm a long-term optimist for Europe, I think at the moment there is not a European polity. And to try and, as it were, force one on it through a process of direct election, I think will be a mistake now. Now, in 50 or 100 years' time, when you have if you have a European polity, that will be a really good idea. But at the moment, I think the way Europe makes progress is intergovernmentally. And therefore, I don't think there will, in practice, be a change to the treaty, because I don't think there will be unanimity around it. Nor personally do I think there should at the moment be that change to the treaty. I think Europe for the foreseeable future is essentially an intergovernmental project, not a single one-election polity project.
Okay, did you want to come back on it very briefly?
I agree with Peter that it is primarily intergovernmental, but it is also balanced by very strong supranational institutions as well in terms of the Commission and the Parliament and the Court of Justice. And I don't think that the governments can simply toss those aside And I think that the uniqueness of Europe is that it balances the two. And one of the reasons why I also support, because I support both in the long run an elected president, but also a stronger role for national parliaments, because I think that we'll never be like the United States. We will always be a union in which the national democracies are going to play a key role.
Okay, Roger, thank you. Right, we're going to sweep. Oh, I beg your pardon. Thank you.
No, just about what the question. I don't think the problem is about the election of the president of the Commission, and I don't think this is how Europe is going to be more democratic. I mean, if we want this Europe to be more democratic, we have to tell to our governments, our governance in Europe, that they have to listen to the people and the protests, like in Greece today, like in Spain, like in Italy. There are like demonstrations every week, and it sounds like they don't hear the people. They are dogmatic, and they think that the European treaty is like or like the Holy Bible. We have to believe everything that is written on it, and we can't change everything.
Anna.
I agree with this idea, and I believe that it's time to push history. And I believe that if before the elections, the big two families, or the other European families, were there European families with national elected people, present candidates for the presidency post with concrete political programs, it will be very difficult for the Council not to accept them. It is not according to the treaty, but it is an opportunity and a need to push history and to create events.
Thank you very much. The gentleman over here.
Yes, good morning. Carl Wright, I'm Secretary General of the Commonwealth Local Government Forum. I appreciate we're talking about the world beyond Europe after the coffee break, but I don't think you can really compartmentalize things. And the thing I'd like to ask the panel, and perhaps particularly Mr. Martin, is really how is the interface between the globalization, which what Liddle referred to, and Europe, because just as in the 30s, I don't think Britain could isolate itself from what was happening on the continent. In the same way, I don't think Europe can isolate itself from what's happening in the wider world. And if one looks at the impact of the financial crisis, its origins in the USA and the financial system, if one looks at the issue of China, if one looks at what's happening in Mali, in Pakistan, in countries like Zimbabwe, where I think on Peter's scale, the crisis is certainly 1 to 2, not 5 to 6. So really what I'd like to ask the panel, how do they see the impact of what is perhaps a much more profound crisis internationally, which also of course affects other global institutions such as the UN and the Commonwealth? How is that impacting on the democracy in Europe? And indeed, particularly Mr. Martin, how can you isolate any particular country like France from that globalization? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Paul-Alexandre, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, about the globalization and the necessity of Europe, I totally agree that we need to cooperate between states so we can face up the globalization and the what we call les pays émergents en France, the new countries who are growing, especially China. But we don't have to forget that those countries like China, like Argentina, like Brazil, like India, they protect their borders and they don't, respect all the World Trade Organization rules like we do it in Europe today. And in Europe, you know that with the treaties, we can't protect our borders with taxes or with another mean. I don't remember the name in English. So I think we need to cooperate between us, but we have to make our own rules and not the World Trade Organization rules, just as China, just as India. And I would like to say another thing. Someone was saying before, like, when we're talking about Europe, we are very small compared to the world, but we have very powerful countries such as France, such as UK, such as Germany. And when you look at our economy compared to the new growing countries, I mean, we can face them. That's not a problem. We are not. It's not because we have only a little space on the world map that we can't face them. That's what I think.
Okay, thank you. I have a lot of questions, so we'll keep going on some questions. We'll sweep across. Yes, sir, the chap just here. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm a student member of Chatham House. My name is Max Lisewski. The question I wanted to ask relates to the democratic deficit in the European Union. Now, what I feel has been talked about a lot is the problem that lies with the European Union, with its institutions. And firstly, I'd like to address that by saying that firstly, people who work at the European Union in high positions like commissioners are themselves elected. We trust our national governments to nominate people to make decisions for us, so why do we not trust them to represent our issues at the European level? Solutions to the democratic deficit. There are some who say that we should have European presidential elections, that we should have United States of Europe where we popularize political issues to involve people. And there are those that we say who say that we should have a technocratic or regulatory institution. I was wondering what the panel thought about this issue and whether the democratic deficit were a communications issue, as it were, between not only top-down but also bottom-up.
Okay, thank you. Who'd like to pick that up?
I basically agree with you, and it has been suggested, not by Roger, but we should elect not just the presidents of the Commission or the Council, but the commissioners. And I actually think, in an odd way, the current system, again, it's slow and it's imperfect, but I think if we were to elect commissioners, if each country were to elect its own commissioner, I think that would be a recipe for chaos and division, because at the moment, the way it works, as it were, informally, is the commissioners know they've got to get on with each other, and they've got to get on with the government of their own country, even if quite a lot of the time, because commissioners are appointed, the government that appointed them is turfed out at an election. So at any given time, 8 or 10 or 12 or 15 commissioners are from the opposition party back home. Now, if they're directly elected, then you institutionalize conflict between individual commissioners and their own government for much of the time in many countries. Whereas at the moment, there is a process of give and take and of what was the French term? Cohabitation. There is a practice and a culture of cohabitation, which I think is in danger of being lost if you have direct election. So I go back. For the moment, Europe, I think, is and should remain essentially an intergovernmental project, and direct election might be counterproductive.
It's a hard sell out there, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, I think that if you had an elected president, I'm not in favour of commissioners elected by each member state, because you would have no coherence. But I think that if you had a president who was chosen, then the commission, it wouldn't be a one-party commission, but the people who would agree to serve it would have to be willing to go along with the leadership offered by the president, which would have been set out in their manifesto. Now, but I wanted to make a point about the intergovernmentalism and making it work better. When I was advising Tony Blair, one of the things I was, one of my hobby horses was that we needed to make it much more transparent that decisions that are taken in Brussels are actually decisions which British ministers vote for. In other words, it's not Brussels imposing things on us. These are things that we've actually stuck our hand up for. And therefore, I argued that we should have a minister based in Brussels who represented the government on all the different councils and came back to Parliament, to a European committee in the Parliament, which happens in some Nordic countries, and said, this is what's coming up next week, this is what I intend to do, this is how I'm going to vote, and then you'd have a question time in the House of Commons at which this minister was answerable for what she or he had done. Now, and I think that would make the whole process more transparent. Now, there are arguments against which I can go through at great length, but that it makes compromise more difficult, that it's much better to trust the perm rep to do this job for you, that, you know, all those sort of arguments. But I think there would be a big gain in transparency, and people would see much better how the European Union was working, actually worked.
Okay, thank you for that. Right, we're still working our way across. Yes, so there's a gentleman here. Sorry, I missed you. I'll come back to you in a second. Yes.
Yes, Robert Morland. I'm a former member of the European Parliament. And could I say, I would have thought the most obvious thing in terms of changes to make certainly a sense of democrat is to get rid of this ludicrous situation of 27 commissioners and 1 commissioner per member state. And if you think about it, it means 6, dare I say 5.5, who represent 70% in terms of population, and the rest, a third at best. I would have thought that's a pretty ridiculous situation. But my real point, I agree entirely with Peter, but I debate regularly against UKIP, and they always start off with democracy. That's their first line. It's about unelected people, people over there taking decisions for us. It's about perception is surely the real issue we have to address. And indeed, I think it's probably the problem with the speech that I wouldn't agree with, which was going to take place today. That a lot lies behind it, although, if I may say so, I can't resist, as the commissioners here, saying if we got rid of social affairs out of all that, I wouldn't be unhappy.
Okay. I think we get your point, and I think many people would clearly agree with some of those notions. Why are there so many European parliaments dotted around the EU? Luxembourg, Strasbourg, Brussels, etc. So many ways in which you could perhaps put on a much better face. I did say I would ask you, sir. Yes.
William Horsley, I'm a journalist, and in response to Peter, I'd just say there's a counter-argument on critical British press on Europe, which is that really very similar form of mauling of politicians and questioning of things that are directed also at our own politicians here. But I wanted to come back to the question put by our Commonwealth friend. I think it's important to look at the other dimension of democracy, which is the ability to protect and project democracy in a more increasingly hostile world. Last night, Kofi Annan gave a really frightening picture of the threats from North Africa across to the arc of conflict through the Middle East, Pakistan, Afghanistan. And this is impinging, of course, on the southern borders of Europe, Italy and Greece, with mass migration and other threats. And so the question really is, is there a failure not only of internal democracy, perhaps, but also of commitment to democracy in relation to the rest of the world? Europe being a model for democracy. We saw the way that Russia arguably pushed Europe around when it annexed part of Georgia effectively, and we now see challenges closer to home.
Well, thank you for that. I think that really is one of the nubs of what we might be talking about a bit later. I don't know if anyone wants a quick line on that, or we'll take... Fair enough, briefly.
I agree entirely with him, and indeed with what Carl Wright said earlier. and actually, when you had, in the early and really optimistic stages of the Arab Spring, the voice you were hearing on the streets of Cairo or Benghazi or Tripoli, I'm sure you were there with them, they were saying, we want what you've got in Europe. And I think what was being meant was not so simply that you have elections, but that you have free speech, that you have reasonably competent and impartial administration, that you address corruption, that you have courts that administer the law impartially. You have all these aspects of democracy, and I agree. The danger is that in Mali or in Bahrain or in Syria or wherever, that's being lost. And perhaps part of our job as Europeans is not merely to be perhaps a bit more optimistic than some are, but to actually bang the drum for democracy in its wisest sense.
Okay, thank you very much. We are running pretty low on time, so I'm going to rush through a few more contributions and questions. Sir, there in the middle, and then just in front.
Thank you. Filippo Costa Boronelli, PhD student at King's College London. the arguments made so far have put in relation democracy crisis and European Union with respect to the democratic deficit within European institutions and the rise of anti-democratic political parties in several southern countries, member countries. However, I would like to focus and to share with you my reflections on a certain relation between the European governance and the special economic model that the European governance is proposing to solve the crisis and the structural democratic and political conditions within member countries. Yesterday, my co-national Mario Draghi said that due to political uncertainty, foreign investors might be drifting away from Europe, especially the southern countries. So my question is, can this narrative of inviting investors and foreign capitals by promising and showing political certainty and stability lead to a decrease in domestic pluralism, in a decrease of political parties, in an increase of electoral thresholds to enter domestic parliaments, and therefore at the expense of democratic values? In every single manual of political theory, the number of parties is usually associated to a thriving democracy. So to what extent is the economic narrative of Europe conciliable with democratic pluralism and vitality in member countries?
Okay, thank you. Peter?
This is, as well, one of the never-ending issues of democracy. Democracy, by its nature, is uncertain. People might change their minds. So what we've tried to do in different countries over the generations is to try and find a balance between choice, which by its nature creates uncertainty, and a degree of stability that doesn't frighten away the investors. At the moment, that's part of the debate about whether Britain should have a referendum. And I don't think there is either a single correct nor a permanent answer to that. And it's part of the never-ending debate around how we order our affairs. So, I think you've identified a really interesting and important problem, but I don't think there's a single permanent or universal answer.
Okay, I know go on, Roger, yeah.
I was just going to say that I think that in terms of public support for the European Union, the absolutely critical thing is to get the economics sorted out and get the euro working properly. If you look at the British statistics, I mean, I think I'm right, Peter, aren't I, that support for Europe in Britain has always grown when it's looked as though Europe was doing well economically, which was true at the end of the 80s.
They hate Europe until they're faced with the prospect of departure.
Yes.
They go, ah!
Yes, quite.
Yeah.
True at the end of the 90s. So let's get the economy sorted, and a lot of these problems of populism we'll talk about will fade, in my view.
Thank you. We have time for one last question. I will have it from here.
Thank you very much. George Hyatt, Record Currency Management and a member of Chatham House. Firstly, on the topic of the economic crisis and economics being too big for national governments, economics has been an international affair for several centuries. I can point you to debates in the House of Commons in the 1780s on the East India collapse that would show that. And other national governments deal with an international economic system without relying on a supranational organisation. And I think it would be wrong to say that no French or German or British or Polish or Dutch government could deal with the international economic system without the support of Europe. And that's a fallacy that could be very dangerous to the idea of national democracy and national futures, and indeed the fate of a nation state. But most important is the question of populism. We've heard the word populism a lot in this debate. There are two issues with that. The first is that populism is a term that is widely applied both to some really very dangerous and problematic parties on both the far left and the far right that could destroy democratic systems and undermine fundamental rights. But it's also used increasingly for anything that's anti-European. A populist policy is one that the people want, but the European government and governance systems don't. And they are, as Paul-Alexandre has highlighted, mostly unelected, appointed sometimes by national governments, sometimes from within their own ranks. Isn't there a danger that in using the term populism to attack things that you don't agree with, rather than listening to what the people actually want, only enhances not only the moderate populist parties, but the positively dangerous populist parties who want to undermine democracy?
Okay, I think Roger, you
Yes,
springing in there.
Of course, as individual nation states, we could deal with the international economic system without the EU. We could, but we'd be a lot less influential. That's the point. I think in Britain, we still live in a world of illusion about our position in the world. Throughout the period of the Labour government, there was this phrase that was endlessly repeated by Gordon Brown about Britain being the 4th largest economy in the world. I think we're now the 8th largest, but we're still pretty large. But the fact is that if you look at global trends, if you look at that report that the National Intelligence Council of the United States produced on global trends, we'll be 2% or less of the world economy by 2030. And Asia, the Asian economy will be double the size of the America and the European Union combined. Surely those trends are the strongest argument. And I'm not saying you should rubbish people who are against Europe, but tell them the facts, tell them the basic arithmetic. The fact is, the world we're moving to is one where we need the European Union.
Can I just say,
last remark, Peter.
Can I say, you're wrong. Not only is the world's finance and business much more integrated investment than it was, but it's simply not true there were no international institutions. What was the British Empire, for goodness sake? Wasn't that simply a political device, not a particularly democratic or egalitarian one, designed to impose our order on the international commercial and financial and business connections we had?
And Paul-Alexandre, a question about populism there to close us up on?
Maybe about the economy, what was told about the economy and Europe and the necessity of Europe. Again, in 20 years in France, we have lost 2 million industrial jobs. Especially during the last 5 years, during the presidency of Nicolas Sarkozy, we have lost 500,000 industrial jobs. And this Europe is, I heard the necessity of cooperation between states, that's what I told before. But in this model, actually, what is happening is that we just see our employees and our jobs and our industries go to Asia, okay? And we can't do anything to face this. So I don't see what's going to happen next, because I remember first we were told that it was going to be about agriculture, then about industry, then it's going to be about services. What is going to remain in Europe then? That's the question I'm asking. For example, now the call centers in France are going in North Africa, okay? So, and I'm talking about call centers for public institutions, such as the institution in Paris that run our department, okay? That specific contract, okay, for those. And all of that is leaving Europe, and what is going to happen next? 50% of the young people are unemployers in Spain. I thought it was about 60% in Greece, 25% in France. What's next?
What's next, indeed. Paul-Alexandre, thank you very much indeed. And can I just say to Lord Liddle, Roger Liddle, Paul-Alexandre Martin, and to Peter Kellner, and indeed to Anna Diamantopoulou, thank you very much indeed for all your contributions for this debate. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, of course, for your questions. We've got time for coffee now back upstairs. It's going to be just under 20 minutes before we come back here. Don't forget your bottle of champagne opportunity.